News travelled fast in Persia. The royal roads that linked up the empire were dotted periodically with stables, so that one courier could pass his message on to the next in a sort of relay race, allowing updates to get from the frontiers to the heartland in a flash. News from the Aegean could arrive in Persia in as little as 2 weeks, and when the king of Persia got news of what had transpired in Greece, he was not a happy man. The crimes of Athens and Sparta, the murder of Persian envoys, and Athens' support for anti-Persian revolts had gone unpunished. King Darius's army had been defeated by the Athenians alone at a place called Marathon. Immediately new orders were given for the assembly of an army of titanic proportions. Last time 25,000 men had marched under the Persian banner. Now Darius would hurl an army larger than most cities in Greece against the whole country. Because whereas last time his targets had been the cities of Athens and Eritrea, now Darius planned to bring the whole of Greece to heel. Such was the scale of his preparations that in summer 486 BC, nearly 4 years after the Battle of Marathon, they drove the Egyptians to rise in revolt. Not in a million years would Persia trade Egypt for Greece, so the expedition was called off, and its army was instead pointed at the land of the Nile. The great king planned to lead the army himself, but in October he died. His throne, his empire, and his quest for revenge were inherited by his son. Though Xerxes was not Darius's eldest, he was judged the best, and more decisively still, his mother was a certain Atossa, the daughter of Cyrus, the king who had won the Persians their empire. So Xerxes picked up where Darius left off, marching to Egypt at the head of the army. Already Xerxes was displaying his skills as a ruler, but he had enjoyed a royal upbringing, the very best on offer in the Persian Empire. Not everyone gets so lucky when it comes to acquiring new skills. That's why this video is sponsored by Skillshare, the best way to learn countless new skills. I myself am always looking to improve the content I make for YouTube, and Skillshare offers tons of classes on upping my game. I can take classes on video editing, marketing, or writing. Whether it's your career, a side hustle, or just a passion of yours, Skillshare has classes for it. It's the largest online learning community, with thousands of classes curated by the very best in their respective fields. In things as varied as 3D animation, Microsoft Excel, music theory, or making pottery. With 2025 beginning, there's no better time to work on and enhance your creativity. It's as Cicero says, a computer without Skillshare is like a body without a soul. I'm fairly certain he said that anyway. The first 500 people to use my link in the description will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. Get started today. With that said, back to Xerxes. In 485 the Egyptian rebels were reduced to servitude once more, and to rule them as satrap, Xerxes appointed Achaemenes, his own brother, and a man who would play a key role in the invasion of Greece. Having tamed one nation, the King of Kings now pondered the taming of a second. Very quickly his eye was turning towards the Greeks. War fever was in the air, although Xerxes was briefly distracted twice more by rebellious Babylonians. Chief among those who argued for the invasion was the king's own cousin, Mardonius. Not that Xerxes really needed the encouragement, but there were others, Greeks in fact, who eagerly urged him to descend upon their erstwhile homeland. These were exiles, as vengeful and homesick as any, but more than that, they were the former rulers of Sparta and Athens. On one hand there was Demaratus, a former king of Sparta, wrongfully deposed from his throne back in 491. On the other there were the Pisistratids, descendants of the last tyrants of Athens. With affairs in Egypt and Babylonia settled, preparations began anew for a wholesale invasion of Greece. Men were drawn from all over the Persian Empire, from the Ethiopians of the south to the Bactrians of the Far East, to the Sacae of the steppe, and the Tibarenians, Moschians, and Mossynoicans of the Caucasus. Just a handful of the many groups that made up this huge army, over 200,000 strong. Marching towards Greece were innumerable peoples whose names the Greeks could scarcely pronounce, much less recognise. The meeting point for all these men was Sardis, the great city of the west. From there the army would march northwest towards the Hellespont, a narrow strait which it would have to cross. Once in Europe, it would hug the coast of the Aegean Sea, wrapping around towards Athens and the Peloponnese. The shadow cast by Persia was long and growing darker. Understandably, those caught under it began to shiver and make ready as best they could. Some cities gave in, while others resolved to fight. Athens and Sparta, of course, had no choice. They would fight and win and live, or be destroyed. For the Spartans, men who had trained for war from childhood, getting ready to fight one was a simple matter. But in Athens, questions of military strategy were being furiously debated. Though Athens is best remembered today as an overseas naval empire, once upon a time it had but a puny fleet, and was frequently embarrassed at sea by Aegina. Yes, that pinprick of an island there, just on Athens' doorstep. If Athens could not police its own neighbourhood, it had no chance against the naval might of the great king. Many in Athens didn't even want a navy. The aristocrats, as well as the farmers, weaned on the traditional virtues of landlubbing hoplite warfare, saw no reason to pay for a fleet, which with its lack of property requirements always struck them as distinctly plebeish. On the other hand, the naval lobby in Athens, led by a statesman of rare foresight called Themistocles, understood perfectly well that Greece could only be saved with the combination of a strong army and fleet. Firstly, it would prevent the Persians outflanking the Greek land forces by sea. Secondly, and more importantly, if Xerxes' army was as big as some feared, it would have to be in constant contact with supply ships. It wouldn't be able to sustain itself off the land alone. If the Greeks could break that link and starve the invaders, even for just a few weeks, the Persians were toast. Greece would need all the ships it could get, but to Themistocles getting them appeared frustratingly impossible until 483 BC, when, in one of those unpredictable fortuities upon which history sometimes hinges, fate intervened. 25 miles south of Athens, the Laurium silver mines struck a vast new deposit, so lucrative that within 1 year, the government had raked in 2.5 tons of pure silver. And they say money doesn't grow on trees. Predictably, Themistocles seized on this to propose building 200 fresh ships. Predictably, the farmer hoplite faction fought back. Money might no longer be an issue, but manning a huge fleet would entirely drain Athens' manpower, denying her any hoplite force at all. Their most esteemed politician, Aristides, told the people that this bonanza should be shared between them, 10 drachmae for all, relying on the simple seductive logic of populism. Faced with what was essentially a bribe, Themistocles racked his brains. Though war with Persia was some years out, every month its menace loomed a little closer, and Themistocles could see clearly how much was riding on the construction of a fleet. Nothing less than the very survival of Athens. In the end, though, when he rose to speak, he forgot all that. The Persians were far away, and some still doubted that they would come to Greece. So he found a menace much closer to home, and far more reviled in the Athenians' hearts. They should build a fleet, yes, and they should build it to get revenge on those troublesome twerps from Aegina. No longer would they raid the harbours of Athens and humiliate its people. This fleet would crush that up-jumped rock, and, Themistocles supposed, it could also be used against Persia if it came to it. This appeal won the people round, but only somewhat. The assembly voted on a compromise of 100 ships, but Themistocles would not be balked. He would have his 200 even if he had to destroy Aristides to get them, who for his part was similarly intransigent. Their debates were now beginning to paralyse democracy. A vote of ostracism or exile was needed. One of them would have to go. The vote was set for a spring day in 482 BC, and when all was counted, Aristides' name was read out, and he departed shortly after for exile. To the Athenians waiting impatiently for the news, there was only one option left to them now: learn how to row. Warships began to crowd the docks and cramp the fish. 2 were being built every week, as the city finally put its back into it. To the north, Persian engineers were labouring away on a canal through the Athos Peninsula, so that the fleet could avoid rounding its treacherous headland. And as spring turned to summer in 481, envoys from the King of Kings headed to every city in Greece, every city save Sparta and Athens, asking euphemistically for earth and water. In other words, submission. If the ancient Greeks had bothered to keep words of the year, then the word of 481 BC would have been Medistein, to Medize. This was what the Greeks termed going over to the Persians. They took it from the Medes, another Iranian people like the Persians, whom they often lumped together. Many cities would Medize in time, especially in the north. Thebes and Argos, two of the most powerful, sat ominously on the fence, and many strongly suspected they would go over to the invaders at the first opportunity. As the Persian heralds tramped through Greece, ones from Sparta followed suit, bearing a different message. All those who wished for Greece to be free should set aside their differences, join together and discuss the defence of their country. Eventually, the city of Corinth on the Isthmus was chosen as their gathering point. Many cities on the mainland sent representatives, but the opposition to Xerxes was strongest in the south. The conference was held in autumn, just as the vast Persian host was massing at Sardis. The mood in the two cities was very different. While Sardis bustled, the delegates at Corinth grimly pondered their next move. Little was agreed in the way of strategy, save that Sparta was to lead on land and sea, and that Medizers would be stripped of 1/10 of their wealth. But this conference was remarkable nonetheless. Old enemies like Athens and Aegina buried the hatchet and agreed to sail together in the defence of Greece. Attempts to secure aid from Argos and Sicily failed, while 3 spies were sent to ascertain the true strength of the Persians. As their ships slid out east into the Aegean, the delegates dispersed to their home cities. Next spring the war would begin in earnest. What the spies saw on their journey east would have chilled their blood. In the ports of Ionia, jungles of masts and sails would have bobbed forebodingly in the breeze. An armada of 1,207 ships and 3,000 non-combatant supply vessels. Counting all the men at Sardis was an even tougher task, but there the spies got help from an unlikely friend, Xerxes, the King of Kings. The spies were apprehended and sentenced to death. But when the great king heard of this, he saved them, personally interrogated them, gave them a guided tour of the camp, and then sent them home with notes on the size of his army. That was a close call. Xerxes had nearly let slip an opportunity to terrify the Greeks with the scale of his power. So the fortunate spies returned home, and were able to give a full accounting to the Second League Conference when it assembled in April 480. For the delegates it made for grim listening. Modern historians can't be sure of how many men fought for Xerxes exactly, but it was somewhere in the region of 150 to 250,000. Adding to the gloom were a series of pronouncements from the Oracle of Delphi. In particular, the ones for Sparta and Athens foretold death and destruction. Sparta's began as follows. "Here is your fate, O you who live in Broad Street at Sparta. Great and glorious though your city is, yet men bred of Perseus will sack it. Either that, or a king sprung from the stock of Heracles must perish, and be mourned within the borders of Lacedaemon." It was common knowledge that the 2 kings of Sparta claimed descent from Heracles. The rulers in question, Leonidas and Leotychides, must have wondered which part of the prophecy would be fulfilled, and if it were the latter, which of them would fall. Bad though it sounded, the death of a king seemed like a get-out-of-jail-free card in comparison to the misery prophesied to be heading Athens' way. I could read out all that the oracle told the Athenians, but the first line will suffice. "Why are you sitting there, you fools? Leave, flee to the ends of the earth. Everything," the oracle promised, "is doomed." This was unbearable for the Athenians, who felt compelled to come to Delphi a second time, this time bearing gifts from the sacred precincts of Athena herself. Armed with these, the pronouncement they got was only marginally better. Part of it ran as follows. "So I tell you again in words that shall bear no distortion. While everywhere else will fall that the borders of Cecrops' land contain, yes, and the ravines of the most holy Kitharon as well, yet to Tritogenia far-seeing Zeus grants a wooden wall. Only this will stand defiant, a succour to you and your children." Cecrops' land referred to Attica, while Tritogenia was an epithet of Athena. Perhaps this second prophecy was an attempt by the oracle to hedge its bets, but the Athenians, and indeed all of the Greeks, sincerely believed this to be the wisdom of Apollo, trickling out to them in the form of strange poetry and opaque prophecy. Delphi's words would have to be debated. Sure enough, it became the subject of forensic analysis as each line was dissected and picked apart. Much was made of the wooden wall, which Themistocles said referred to the fleet. Athens would have to trust in her ships if she was to survive, and if it came to it, the Athenians must abandon their city. Havens could be found elsewhere, the islands of Salamis and Aegina, and the city of Treason in the Peloponnese. It was a chilling, terrifying thought, that their very city would have to be turned over to the enemy, that they would have no home or holdout save for the uncertain surge of the sea. The Athenians placed their trust in Themistocles and his wooden wall, but everyone was hoping that the Persians would be checked to the north of their city. For now they were on the march. Spring spelled the start of the campaign season, and while the Greeks were meeting for their second conference, Xerxes began his slow march to war. After a bit of sightseeing at Troy, the King of Kings arrived at the Hellespont. A marble throne had been erected for him to view his assembled forces, the greatest army the world had yet seen. No power on earth, he was sure, could stand up to him. So when his uncle, an old man called Artabanus, told him that the two greatest things in existence were his bitterest enemies, Xerxes was understandably surprised. Artabanus explained himself. In his view, the great king's greatest enemies were the sea and the land, for there was no port that could hold all his ships, no land that could sustain his army's insatiable hunger, and so he would need his ships all the more. But Xerxes, while admitting that Artabanus had a point, told his uncle to stop fretting. More than any man before him, Xerxes had done his utmost to tame the land and the sea. He had already made sea where there was once land by cutting through the Athos Peninsula. Now he would make land where there was once sea by bridging the Hellespont. If the number of warships in Xerxes' fleet seems exaggerated, this is because not all of them went to Greece. The Hellespont was bridged with two vast pontoons, built of 674 warships tethered side by side. Subtract that from the original total of 1,207, add the 120 ships the Persians then recruited from Thrace and the islands, and Xerxes had 653 warships with which to crush the Greeks. The original pontoons were scattered by bad winds, but after beheading the engineers responsible and whipping the sea, Xerxes had them reassembled, and the army began its crossing. A local, watching the hundreds of thousands of men walk across the waters, responded with understandable shock and awe. "Why, O Zeus, have you taken on the form of a man from Persia and swapped your own name for that of Xerxes? And why, if your aim is to devastate Greece, bring the entire world with you? After all, you hardly need their assistance to accomplish that." On a very unhelpful level, all the Greeks felt the same way about where they should face Xerxes. That is, to the north of their own city. No one wanted to be hung out to dry. Some Peloponnesians wanted to hold the Isthmus of Corinth, Athens be damned. The horrified Athenians argued, understandably, in favour of a defensive line further north. So a force of 10,000 Greeks was first dispatched to the narrow Tempe Pass, north of Thessaly. But when they discovered how rife with Medisers all of Thessaly was, they wisely withdrew. Their next choice was far better, a narrow pass to the south of Thessaly, called Thermopylae. But Thermopylae was only half the story, because 40 miles east was a narrow strait between the island of Euboea and the mainland, well suited for stoppering any approaching fleet. These two choke points could stop the Persians in their tracks, so the Greeks got to work. The lumbering pace of Xerxes' army meant that it was already late in the season by the time Thermopylae was fought. A Greek force of 7,000, led by the Spartan king Leonidas, and a Greek fleet of 271 warships took up their positions in early August. The Greek army was so small because this campaign coincided with the Spartan Carneia festival, as well as the Olympic Games. The Spartans were devoutly religious folk, and the Carneia prevented them from marching to war. Only Leonidas and 300 of his personal bodyguard, as well as a few hundred more Helot slaves, had been free to go north, gathering reinforcements from other cities as they marched. The Carneia would end on the 20th of August, so Leonidas had to hold out until the end of the month for reinforcements. Luckily for him, he had a superb defensive position. Thermopylae meant the Hot Gates. There were 3 gates in question, 3 points where the mountain and the sea squeezed tightly together, leaving very narrow stretches of flat land. The east and west gates were just 4 meters wide, but the cliffs here were not steep enough to prevent attackers from scrambling around, so Leonidas chose the middle gate, 15 meters wide but flanked by the steepest cliffs, to make his stand. Here, an ancient wall ran across the road, built in centuries past to guard against invasions from the north. Now Leonidas rebuilt the wall and returned it to its ancient function. Meanwhile, the Greek fleet was beached at Artemisium, similarly awaiting the arrival of Persia's armada. 3 Greek scout ships, which were supposed to give advanced warning of the fleet's advance, had been surprised and scattered by a squadron of Phoenicians serving the Great King. After this debacle, the Greeks moved, first to a narrowing in the straits, then to the city of Chalkis, much further south. Around the 12th of August, Xerxes' navy, led by his brother Achaemenes, the satrap of Egypt, arrived on the northern shores of the strait, while his army was just outside Thermopylae by the 14th. First blood had gone to the Phoenicians, and the seaward approaches to Thermopylae were now unguarded. What had the Greeks been thinking? Well, August is a cruel time to be at sea. Baked by the sun, the land heats up and encourages storms and gales, and on the 13th of August, one such storm descended on the coast. For 3 days it lasted. On the 16th of August, the Greeks returned to their position at Artemisium. From there they could see to the north the Persian fleet, still seaworthy in spite of the battering it had received. Watching as that huge armada blackened the horizon, the Greeks nearly lost their nerve again. Their commander at Artemisium was technically a Spartan, Eurybiades, but in reality power lied with the states that actually sent the ships. In this case, Themistocles the Athenian had the most weight to throw around, but commanders from the other naval states like Corinth also held sway, and the Peloponnesians, seeing how great the Persian navy was, began contemplating a retreat to the Isthmus of Corinth, which was after all where they had initially wanted to defend. Themistocles was dismayed, but not as much as the local Euboeans, who feared being left in the lurch. It was said that to save themselves the Euboeans offered Themistocles a 30-talent bribe to stay. Cheerfully he accepted. That was roughly 3/4 of a ton of silver, and then Themistocles bribed the other commanders with 8 talents, pocketing the rest for himself. They would be staying at Artemisium. More fool them, Achaemenes may have thought. For on the night of the 16th, 200 ships split off from the Persian fleet and sailed northeast. Once they were out of sight, they swung south and prepared to circumnavigate the island of Euboea. While Achaemenes held his position in the north, they made ready to attack from behind and sweep clear the strait. The Greeks were none the wiser until a diver, a defector from the Persian camp, swam across the strait to tell them of the trap on the 17th. The flanking ships might arrive as early as the 19th of August, but in the danger there existed opportunity. Achaemenes' fleet, now numbering roughly 400, still dwarfed the Greeks' 271 ships, but not by as much. The flanking force would be even more vulnerable, given that roughly 100 Athenian ships had been left behind to defend Attica. If these were tipped off and gave chase to the Persians, and then the fleet at Artemisium sailed south, the flankers would become the flanked. For this to work, however, Achaemenes would have to think that the Greeks were going nowhere, that they still had no clue about his plan. It was therefore decided on the 18th of August to face the invader head-on. Meanwhile on land, Xerxes gave the order to attack the hoplites in the hot gates. His 200,000 soldiers had been sitting on their hands for 4 days now, picking the surrounding farms clean of any food. Normally the supply ships were supposed to make up the deficit, but with the Greeks guarding the straits nothing could get through. This was why they had chosen to make their stand here. They would conquer the Persians through their stomachs. Battle began early on land, with Xerxes first dispatching the Medes, doughty and reliable soldiers from Iran, and when they failed to dent the Greeks manning the wall, he unleashed the famous Immortals. These were Xerxes' crack troops, but their fame and skill at arms availed them little in the face of the hoplites. Simply put, the men of Asia fought with lighter arms and armour than the Greeks. Where the Medes and Immortals bore shields of wicker, the Spartans were made of wood and bronze, and all the Persians got that day was a bloody nose. But what of the battle at sea, just off Artemisium? That began with night just a couple of hours away, so if anything went wrong, the Greeks wouldn't have to fight long. Their caution was warranted, because in their determination to convince Achaemenes they weren't planning to pull back, they were fighting in the one place they wanted to avoid, the open sea. The Persians, smelling blood, advanced. Their much larger navy began to engulf the smaller Greek one. The elite Phoenician squadrons pressed forth round the flanks of their enemies, only to watch in perplexity as the Greek flanks seemed to retreat and bend back, until, frustratingly for the Persians, they formed a circle. Now you can surround a circle, but you can't outflank one. If any Persian ship got too close, a Greek ship would lunge at them before quickly retreating to the circle. The first day of Artemisium was a nasty surprise for the Persians, even more so than Thermopylae. 30 of their ships were captured by the Greeks before night fell, and in the darkness another defected. Then, in the darkness, a second storm broke. For both fleets, safely beached on opposite shores, it was an annoyance, but to anyone sailing round Euboea, say 200 Persian ships, it would have been a catastrophe. And indeed that unfortunate task force was brutally mauled, many ships being smashed to kindling on the rocks. Not all the ships were lost, but enough had been damaged to immediately cancel the entire expedition. The Greek rear was saved. The following day, the 19th of August, the balance of power shifted further when 53 of the Athenian ships previously tasked with guarding Attica arrived to reinforce, and when a squadron of Persian ships was caught isolated and attacked and mauled. There was no major sea battle on the 19th, but on land the story was much the same as the first day, with the Persians making no progress against the wall. Tomorrow, the 20th of August, marked the end of the Carnea. Soon the full force of Sparta and her allies would be on the march, as Leonidas was well aware. The stalemate had held so far. It only had to hold for a little while longer. But on the night of the 19th of August, Xerxes met his favourite Greek so far, a local farmer called Ephialtes. He told the King of Kings of a pass running over the mountain, one which bypassed Thermopylae. Leonidas had been aware of this pass since he arrived, and had posted there 1,000 hoplites from the region of Phocis, assuming that he would need all of his Spartans down below. On the morning of the 20th, Xerxes dispatched his immortals up the path, and then went to have his breakfast. Far to the south, the city of Sparta was waking up, as, high up on the mountains, were the Phocians. So far they had done nothing but sit around and pick their noses. But when the immortals, appearing suddenly from the darkness and unleashing a torrent of arrows, attacked, the Phocians were caught entirely unprepared, and foolishly retreated to a nearby hill. The immortals approached, and walked straight on past. The immortals had just one task, to destroy the Greeks in the pass. They had no time to waste on the Phocians, and now the Phocians had kindly vacated the path. Forewarned of this peril, Leonidas called a council of war. Opinions were split, with Leonidas hoping to still hold the pass, and most others calling for an immediate retreat. In the end, this was granted, but the Spartans? They would stay. This was probably more than just heroism, since someone had to stay behind to stop the Persian cavalry sweeping through the pass and chasing the Greeks south. As the sun rose over Thermopylae and their allies left for safety, the Spartans and the other bravehearts who decided to stay got ready for battle. "Eat a good breakfast," Leonidas told his men, "for tonight we dine in Hades." On this, the last day of their lives, the Spartans chose not to hide behind the wall at Thermopylae, though some of their allied troops did man the wall. They would fight and die on the open field. There were 2 Spartans, sick with eye infections, not present on the field of battle. One of them, despite being half-blind, ordered his helot slave to lead him to Thermopylae, where he was to meet his end. As for the other, well, he was to endure a fate worse than death. The Persians were bearing down on all sides. Xerxes synchronized his frontal assault with the Immortals' descent. Now a fearsome battle broke out. notable for all the princely blood that was spilt. Two half-brothers of Xerxes, princes called Abracomes and Hyperanthes, fell in a fight over the corpse of King Leonidas, who himself had just been slain. 4 times his body fell into the invaders' grasp, 4 times the Greeks tore it back, until at last they retreated to a hillock behind the wall, where most of them, Spartans, Thespians, and of course the Helots, those slaves of Sparta, were slaughtered. A band of Thebans managed to be taken prisoner. In later times, their sacrifice would be commemorated by a stone lion raised atop the Spartans' mass grave. The inscription it bore was one of the most famous in history. "Go tell the Spartans, strangers passing by, that here, obedient to their laws, we lie." A heroic sacrifice perhaps, but entirely in vain. Xerxes had flushed the Greeks out from Thermopylae in just 2.5 days. Now all of Greece north of the Isthmus lay open to him. At last he would take his revenge upon Athens, and Sparta after that. Having cleared the land, news of his victory soon reached the sea. In the straits a frightful battle was still raging amidst the great din of dying, drowning men and the splintering of wood. It had begun in the morning and would rage until nightfall. The Greeks chose not to repeat their circle formation, but instead retreated westward and fought in a narrower part of the strait, where the Persian advantage in numbers would be similarly neutralised. Unwisely, Achaemenes ordered his ships forward, and the fighting quickly degenerated into a messy slugging match, with neither side able to achieve a decisive advantage. Again, darkness drew the curtain on this final clash at Artemisium. Again, the Greeks had survived the onslaught of the imperial fleet, but at great cost. Half of the Athenian warships were out of commission. The Persian fleet had also taken heavy losses, and perhaps the most important consequence of these battles was that Xerxes went into the next stage of the war with reduced strength at sea, though he still outnumbered the Greeks on that front. Tired and bloodied, the Greeks slumped onto the beaches at Artemisium. Yet when news arrived of the disaster at Thermopylae, they immediately made ready to leave. Night journeys were a rarity for Greek sailors, but there was nothing else to be done. So the Allied navy retreated with all haste around the coast of Attica, in hopes of fighting another day. Athens would have been to their right as they rounded the coast of Attica, and the city was alive with bustle and noise. The last of its people were packing their bags and leaving. The barbarian was not at the gates anymore, he was beyond them, and any day now Athens would be burned. Xerxes and Achaemenes advanced with the twin prongs of their invasion, accepting the submission of the Boeotian cities which had offered no resistance, and ravaging those, Thespiae, Plataea, and the whole region of Phocis, which had. A week later their fate was visited on Athens, but not on the Athenians. They had been evacuating since June, and any foot draggers were jolted into action by the catastrophic news from Thermopylae. Xerxes arrived to find the city that had troubled him so much entirely abandoned. Well, almost entirely. Bewildered dogs still roamed the streets calling for their families. Rats and mice no doubt scuttled about, confused by the eerie quiet. And atop the Acropolis, a band of priests and diehards watched over the holy spaces. The Acropolis was a prime defensive position, but after 5 days the defenders were slaughtered. Denied his other prey, Xerxes had instead set Attica ablaze. Now he did the same to the Acropolis, and for miles around the fire and smoke of that lifeless Athens billowed into the darkening sky. Peloponnesus literally means island of Pelops. Were it not for the isthmus of Corinth, it would be cut off entirely from the mainland. And in the wake of the defeat at Thermopylae, the Peloponnesians had done everything to finish the job. A wall was built across the isthmus, and the roads destroyed. This Peloponnesectomy, as it were, rendered their position impregnable. The Persians would never be able to force the isthmus, not with 30,000 hoplites standing guard. Yet its Achilles' heel was, as ever, the sea. Battered though the Persian fleet was, it still outnumbered the Greek fleet by a couple hundred ships. At the very least, Xerxes had 500 left to throw against an allied Greek navy of 310. But historians of course have a range of opinions on the size of Xerxes' fleet by this stage. If the Persians could deal with the Greek fleet, they would be free to land troops on the Peloponnese, thus negating the strong defensive position at the isthmus. But that would be a tall order. After its withdrawal from Artemisium, the Greek fleet's destination had been the isthmus, where it was to receive fresh orders. But Themistocles managed to convince them to stop off at the island of Salamis, where many Athenians had taken refuge. Not only did he hope to save his compatriots, but he had a plan. If he had his way, they would fight the Persians here, in the narrows between Salamis and the mainland. Unlike the open waters around the isthmus, which favoured the invaders' numbers, the constricted channel negated that advantage and restrained their more manoeuvrable ships. As such, this was the last place the Persians would choose to fight. For their part, Xerxes' ships were beached at Phalerum, the old harbour of Athens, while his huge land forces remained on standby, relegated to the status of onlookers for the time being. The next stage of the campaign would be determined at sea. If Themistocles had his way, it would be determined at Salamis. If Xerxes had his way, it would be anywhere but Salamis. Demaratus, the exiled king of Sparta who had tagged along with the great king, suggested taking a detachment of 300 ships and invading the Peloponnese by sea. That way the defence of the isthmus would be thrown into disarray as contingents rushed back to defend their cities. Immediately, Admiral Achaemenes put that proposal on ice, pointing out that such a sizable detachment would cost them their numerical superiority at sea, so one solution was out of the question already. Xerxes could not wait out his foes either. Firstly, as autumn drew in, it brought harsh gales and stormy seas to the Aegean, which would severely hinder any naval operations as well as the movement of the supply ships upon which the great king's army depended. Secondly, Xerxes, as the head of the largest state on earth, could not be away from the heartlands of his realm for too long. Trouble was always brewing. Twice already his reign had been troubled by revolts in Babylon. Most of his admirals counselled him to seek battle. Alone among them, Queen Artemisia of Halicarnassus advocated patience. She pointed out that the Greeks had supply problems of their own. For how long would the fields and granaries of Salamis be able to feed the tens of thousands of men in the fleet, and thousands of Athenian refugees besides? Disputes and rivalries between the Greeks might also bear fruit. Waiting would, in her words, scatter them in all directions and send them fleeing to their respective cities. A hopeful prediction, and ultimately not one that Xerxes chose to rely on. Nevertheless, it warmed the great king's heart to know that the Greek command was of two minds about what to do, and the arguments were getting ugly. No sooner had the Peloponnesians arrived than they began to regret stopping at Salamis. Themistocles had talked them into it, and now they feared being trapped in the straits, cut off from their homeland. On the night the Acropolis burned, they began scrambling to withdraw. Themistocles, who saw the Salamis channel as their one saving grace, moved to stop them. He met with Eurybiades, the Spartan captain, and their ostensible Grand Admiral, and argued his case. If the fleet gave up its position at Salamis, each contingent would disperse to its own city. The defence would surely collapse when opposition became impossible in the open waters. Eurybiades saw sense in what Themistocles was saying, and called for a council of war. Yet when the Spartan was due to speak, he was interrupted by Themistocles, who was then in turn interrupted by a man of Corinth, Adamantus. In the races, the man who starts before the signal is whipped, he said, admonishing the Athenian. Yes, Themistocles replied, but those who get off the mark late win no prizes. Quips aside, Themistocles eventually said his piece, although he used different arguments to the ones he told Eurybiades. As Herodotus, one of our main historians for these events, notes, it would hardly have been seemly of him to tell them to their faces that he suspected they would scatter and abandon their posts. Instead, he rattled off strategic considerations, namely that the narrow waters favoured their lesser numbers, while the open waters off the isthmus favoured the Persians. But again, Adamantus of Corinth, speaking for many of the Peloponnesians, piped up. As a refugee, a man with no city and no home save the deck of his warship, Themistocles had no right to offer his opinions. Now that Athens had fallen, it shouldn't have a say in how the surviving cities ought to defend themselves. This was nasty, and as Themistocles angrily clapped back, not true. Xerxes had conquered Athens, but he had not conquered the Athenians. Even now, scattered to different shores, there were 200,000 of them, a city greater than Corinth could ever be. The Peloponnesians were most scared about being trapped on Salamis, unable to protect or return to their own homes. Perhaps they were also concerned about the availability of supplies, or hoped that the circle formation, deployed to such success at Artemisium, would again stave off defeat in open waters. In the end, Themistocles went nuclear. If the Greeks did not stay at Salamis, the Athenian ships, over half the fleet, would leave with their people and go to Italy. What remained of the navy would then certainly be annihilated by the Persians. This threat was the clincher, and Eurybiades decreed that they would stay and face the invaders at Salamis. This was all well and good, but they had no way of forcing the Persians to blunder by storming the channel. In other words, Themistocles had committed the Greeks to Salamis, but had no way to commit the Persians to do the same. So they sat there and waited. Xerxes tried his best to psych them out by first drawing up his fleet in the waters before Salamis, and then by sending a column of troops towards the isthmus. Of course, no troops would be getting past the fortifications there, but Xerxes was just trying to shake the Greeks out of their tree. Indeed, the stress did seem to be working. The Greeks had been at Salamis for a couple of weeks now, and the men began to decry the foolishness of Eurybiades in swallowing Themistocles' arguments. When the two men tried to cheer the soldiers up, they were howled down. This was just the type of thing that Xerxes was hoping for. Squabbling and dissension among Greeks was something the Persians had been playing on for decades. It was something they counted on, something they courted in fact. It seems likely that Persian agents were probing the Greek captains for weak links, looking for those that might go over to the great king, promising bribes here and royal pardons there. And then they struck gold. Once again the Peloponnesians seemed liable to withdraw, to forsake Salamis and all those living on it. For Themistocles and his fellow Athenians, this would mean leaving their countrymen on Salamis for dead. Everyone was getting tetchy, and Xerxes' agents probably reported to him the arguments in the high command. One night a small boat put out from the Greek camp and stole across the waters. It carried an interesting man, who himself carried an interesting message. His name was Sisinus, he told the Persians, and he was a slave of Themistocles. Themistocles' message for the great king ran as follows. Disgusted by the Peloponnesians' willingness to hang them out to dry, he now desired a Persian victory, and would help bring one about. Already the allies were at each other's throats, he said, and the following night they planned to withdraw from Salamis under the cover of darkness. If the Persians could catch them in the act, disordered in the darkness, then the Greeks' navy would be easy meat. Especially since, in Themistocles' words, Xerxes would see the pro-Persians among them fighting the rest. Then, this message delivered, Sisinus the slave vanished whence he came. Xerxes already understood Themistocles' price. For his services he and his people would expect the great king's favour, and perhaps forgiveness for their crimes against Persia. He sought from the Persians what the Peloponnesians refused to provide, safety for his people. Athens and Persia, unlikely allies. The Persians made ready to catch the Greeks that night. A detachment of 200 Egyptian ships was sent to block the Salamis channel at its western exit, while the remainder of his fleet, some 300 and something ships drawn from all over the Persian Empire, deployed in the waters outside the southern exit. In dividing his fleet like this, Xerxes exposed both halves. The Greeks, having received reinforcements, still counted 310 warships in their fleet, enough to engage and possibly overwhelm the divided Persians. Yet the possibility of catching the Greeks in flight was too tantalizing to ignore. The Greeks, unlike some of their contemporaries, had not mastered the art of sailing at night. A nighttime ambush would see them disorganized, easy prey for the Persians. And if Themistocles' promise about infighting among the Greeks came true, they would collapse. So the Persians took up their positions. All night they stood guard, but the breakout never came, and by sunrise they would have been weary. Xerxes, who presumably had enjoyed some sleep, ordered his throne to be set up on Mount Egaleo. From his seat here he could watch over the entire scene. Indeed, he was the only man there who could fully see what was going on. He could see the Greeks in the narrows, and his own men in the open water. He must have been itching for a solution to the situation. Then, abruptly, one presented itself. Some 50 ships from Corinth split off and began fleeing up the channel. The disintegration of the Greek fleet, it seemed, was at hand. Though we cannot be sure of this, indeed we can be sure of frustratingly little about the Salamis campaign, Xerxes himself must have given the order to advance. Only he, all-seeing atop Mount Egaleo, could have reacted to this development. The decisive hour, he saw, was upon them. They could not miss this chance, and so the Persian navy advanced into the narrows. With the Phoenician squadrons on the right, the Ionians and Hellespontine squadrons on the left, and a motley array of seafaring peoples making up the centre. Against them stood the rest of the Greek fleet, which, ominously, wasn't going anywhere. Instead, as the beating of innumerable oars carried them forward, the Persian captains could hear singing from across the waters, and could see the hundreds of Greek ships forming an orderly battle line. Their fleet was not crumbling yet, but it did seem to be retreating slowly. The Greeks pulled back, inviting the Persians further in, until, with their backs almost to the shore, a single ship supposedly shot forward and drove its bronze ram deep into an enemy ship. Soon everyone else was piling in. The battle, one of the most important in history, had begun. Bronze rams smashed through wooden hulls, arrow fire was exchanged from one deck to another, boarding parties engaged in the stomach-turning business of ship-to-ship combat. For several hours, the Salamis Strait became hell in miniature. Xerxes had been banking on the division and demoralization of the Greeks, but in the straits they fought, furiously and unrelentingly, as one. Down below all was chaos. No one could really know what was going on outside of their immediate vicinity, but up above, the great king must have soon realized he had been fooled, and disastrously so. It was not the Greek fleet that disintegrated before his eyes, but his hopes for an easy victory. The Greeks, it seems, had been deliberately exaggerating their differences. Themistocles' message and his brave courier Sicinnus had been a feint. Even the Peloponnesians must have been in on the act. Certainly, they had been arguing loudly for a retreat, keyword loudly, but when they discovered that Themistocles had been in secret communications with the Persians, and that they were blockaded, they did not seem too surprised. Instead, they steeled themselves for the battle to come. The Peloponnesians fought no less bravely than the Athenians that day. Even the Corinthian ships hadn't been in flight. Their northward journey served two purposes: to check for whether the Egyptian ships were coming, and to bait Xerxes into attacking a fleet he thought was on the brink of collapse and retreat. After checking the coast was clear, the Corinthians turned back, and threw themselves into a battle that was already going the Greeks' way. In the narrows, the Persian fleet became disorganized, and to compound their problems, the admiral of the Phoenician squadrons, another of Xerxes' brothers, was slain early on, and the loss of their commander put the Phoenicians, purportedly the best sailors in the world, into great disorder. Increasingly, with their superior maneuverability counting for nothing in the cramped waters, the Phoenicians found themselves cornered, crushed against the coast. Soon many of them were in flight, while other bedraggled souls swam ashore. And of course Xerxes' decision to divide his fleet meant that from the outset the numbers were even. 200 Egyptian ships were sitting idle at the far end of the strait, oblivious to the savage battle only a few miles away. Now that many of Xerxes' crack squadrons were in retreat, the tide of battle tilted inexorably in favour of the Greeks. The sight of the Phoenicians in flight disheartened the remaining Persian sailors, who soon found themselves surrounded. By battle's end, his armada had lost 200 ships and many thousands of sailors. Some of his admirals were slain, others fled. Queen Artemisia, seeing the disaster unfolding around her, tried to flee but was blocked by another Persian ship. Coolly, she rammed straight on through, killing all aboard. From above, Xerxes didn't realise Artemisia had rammed her own guys. He was mightily impressed with her, but it did little to improve his mood. "My men have become women," he cried, "and my women men." Xerxes consoled himself by executing a clutch of his captains, and after vainly trying to build a causeway across the strait, he gave up. His fleet had been cut down to numerical parity with the Greek one. Worse still, it was demoralised and mutinous. The Greeks had lost just 40 ships, and an open battle could likely now scatter the Persians. With the Greeks in command of the sea, they could sever the naval supplies upon which the Persian host depended. More terrifyingly still, they could attack the pontoon bridges across the Hellespont and strand Xerxes' army in Europe. A massive withdrawal was necessary immediately. This, of course, was a humiliation for the King of Kings, and it could not end like this. Though the fleet would withdraw to the Hellespont, with the army taking the long way round, a holding force had to be left behind simply to show the world Xerxes was not running with his tail between his legs. Mardonius, the great king's cousin, was chosen to lead this force. As the biggest advocate for war with Greece, Mardonius now had to see it through. With winter fast approaching, the conflict could only resume in earnest sometime in 479, so both sides settled down, in Mardonius's case to plan, in the Greeks' case to squabble. Just before the great king had crossed the Hellespont, his uncle Artabanus had told him that the sea and the land, the two greatest things in existence, were his implacable enemies. This had been a shrewd analysis of the logistics, to be sure, but Artabanus had left out a third enemy, only a little less implacable than the other two, the Greeks themselves. In the face of spine-chilling odds, and in spite of their tendency to fight each other, they had broken the back of the largest armada the world had yet seen, and in so doing forced the retreat of the largest army the world had yet seen. Now Mardonius's much shrunken host bided its time in Boeotia, still slightly larger than the armies of Greece, but small enough that it could supply itself. As such, the land and the sea, to run with Artabanus's euphemism, were no longer Mardonius's major enemies. Instead, it was the Greeks themselves who almost held the power to face the Persians in the open. But whether they would take such a colossal risk was anyone's guess. The Greeks and the Persians made ready for one last push, for their grudge match was nearing its end. Major thanks to my extremely generous Caesar tier patron, Diocletian. Becoming a patron or a YouTube member really is the best way to help out the channel, and encourages me to keep on making these videos. In the spirit of that, I'd like to thank my very loyal and generous console tier members, Chris Manger and Dan Smith. Although my upload schedule has gotten better as of late, the wait between documentaries can take quite a while, so your continued support and patience is greatly appreciated. But until the next one, goodbye.